I'd like to open the floor to questions. With your permission, sir, I'd like to perhaps start with a contention, and that arises from what you said at the end about the supply side requirements in urban management. Is it possible to think that the very fact that post the recent elections, the local bodies have elected the same political parties that have been elected to state legislatures is itself a manifestation of a supply side demand where the public are actually expecting some kind of responses which have been different from the earlier 5 years? And that this entire architecture that the Government of India and all of us have been creating for the last 30, 40 years have totally ignored this. And perhaps, therefore, it's a time to look at the city institutions and governance institutions not from the point of view of institutions to govern, but institutions more to respond to public aspirations, which are very different now than they were about 20, 30 years ago. I'd just like to pose that as a question, but then perhaps you could take a few more questions.
Yeah, sure.
So,
Just one very interesting aspect which I thought was missing, and I'm sure you can add to it. What is the revenue base of urban areas in India, or in South, in this case of India? And where do the budgets come from? Are the local taxation base, which are entirely in the jurisdiction of the local bodies, or do they actually drive the revenues from the state and federal governments?
The recent feature on India in The Economist highlighted Surat as an example of progressive development of an urban space. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Does Surat provide a model for people-driven local government of the kind you were alluding to? Because it does strike me that in Europe, particularly Britain in the 19th century, politicians built national careers on the strength of having been very good local government managers. I'm thinking particularly of Joseph Chamberlain beginning to supply the city of Birmingham with gas in the 1860s and going on to become a national figure. I don't think we've seen anything like that, but perhaps Surat provides some models where local politicians may rise on the strength of their performance.
Okay.
can we take these three?
Yeah, sure. I think this last question, the first question, are somewhat interconnected. In the case of India also, the people who came into national leadership came up on the local government ladder. Jawaharlal Nehru was chairman of the Allahabad Municipal Corporation. Vallabhbhai Patel was chairing Ahmedabad. Many of our national leaders came through the municipal ladder. But for some reason, once they went up, they did not seem to feel that local government needed some attention. They almost discarded the ladder by which they climbed. So much so, the Calcutta Corporation, which was in the vanguard of India's freedom movement, was the first corporation to be thrown out of office. It was superseded in a Cromwellian fashion in 1948 itself. The Madras Corporation was superseded, and for 24 years it remained under supersession. So this was part of the problem, whittling down the municipal domain and taking their powers over and putting them in state-created para-states. Now, so to that extent, where should really demands be addressed, became somewhat diffused. Now, when you talk about Surat, it's not that Surat created, the Surat model of municipal government, its municipal structure has been very much the same, for all these years. But what happened in that area is that, and this is true of all of Gujarat, where the municipal domain has slowly come back to them. Some of the functions which were previously performed by parastatal organizations have gone back to the municipality. And I think in the case of Surat, the plague epidemic gave a great opportunity for them to rearrange the configuration of municipal and parastatal responsibility. So Surat is a city where the city corporation counts. In many other cities, not in Gujarat, elsewhere, in many other cities, the city government does not count. Surat, in spite of the fact that it is not a very attractive city, I mean, there is not one single building in Surat which you can call sufficiently attractive to be photographed in front. Not one single building, but the place is scrupulously clean. The tax collection rate is very high. It's not that people are coming out in the streets demanding this or that, but their performance is, in their action. Tax compliance is very high. The processes of municipal regulation and approval is very high, which also answers partly your question, sir. The only revenue base of Indian cities are property taxes. Property taxes and some user fees to a limited extent. Some of the more buoyant sources of revenue arising from land development and new areas and so on and so forth are in the hands of non-municipal bodies. Every state has a state finance commission which makes an allocation of revenue sharing formula. But because the state governments themselves complain of lack of resources, during the past 10 years, the Government of India's Finance Commission has been asked to look into the needs of the local bodies and see to what extent the state government revenues require augmentation so that they can help them. Some modest improvements are being suggested. Otherwise, the total expenditure of local bodies in India is less than 5%, of the total exchequer. So financially, they are almost bankrupt. And much of the money is utilized only in revenue and staff expenditure, so they do not have a revenue base at all. I should also mention in this that the constitutional amendment provides a whole list of functions which should be discharged by the municipalities. But it is up to the state government to decide and pass a law whether those functions should really be devolved or not. Here again you find the position varying from state to state. Gujarat is one of the few states where the functional domain has been entrusted. In many states, the functional domain is not entrusted to local bodies. The variation is fairly high. So, is Surat the model? I would say properly, local bodies with a functional mandate is the answer. We did have that functional mandate before. We missed out on that. We took it out. We diluted it. We have to go back to that. So to that extent, and that is the faith on which this entire constitutional amendment is based. As far as the chairman's question is concerned, I do feel that demand from citizens is extremely important. But when you take a contemporary city, most of the citizens, their basic interest is to earn a living, to carry on with their daily business. They cannot afford to spend their time supplicating, petitioning, joining in processions and writing, protests all the time. So instead of waiting for the citizens to express their demand, I think it is important that Indians and South Asians understand that there was a time when we did a better job. why do we have this terrible loss of memory? Why can't we go back to the domain which we understood well before, and why can't we restitute the domain?
Okay, I'm a Singaporean Chinese, so this will be an unusual question for me to ask, but do you see a situation where, because from what your description, the governance of cities is what you politely call quite messy, where the private sector, the people sector, will take over running many of the functions. And I give you the example of the Dharavi slum in Mumbai, which has been proven to be exceedingly efficient, and people have built a community there. Do you see more people-led grassroots solutions to problems?
Well, thank you for the presentation. My question is, you talked of the bifurcation of the Dhaka Corporation, for instance, and you said that in Delhi, for instance, there are 3 corporations. As you know, that there is also a huge problem with regard to the politics of the bifurcation of the Dhaka Corporation, and we are getting some kind of a sense that there is a growing movement like the division of Bengal. I mean, you know, it's like halving Bengal in 2. Is an answer having then a central city, a small city, much in the fashion of the city of London, and boroughs, as in New York, absolutely independent, I mean, autonomous with its own chair, etc., running the local governance. One little point about what you said about the state government superseding or rather prevailing over city. Now, each of the South Asian cities have their own sort of evolution. Karachi, for instance, has a population which is ethnically very different from the states surrounding it. Sindh, it's a Urdu-speaking MQMP population. Their leadership have very little intention, wish to go further up the ladder into national politics. Controlling Karachi is good enough for the MQM. So there, the point is, it's an isolated problem in Karachi, and it's unique. And in many ways, all the South Asian cities perhaps have unique features. They have to be addressed uniquely rather than generalize about them. That's a very broad point, but the first is more difficult.
Okay, let me, in essence, we are saying that whether it's a metropolitan situation or whether it is a smaller city, there's a good deal of diversity. And how do we really accommodate that diversity? One way is that there are situations where the city government as such is not able to perform or is not able to reach or, finds itself excluded. And Dharavi is an example of that, where somehow a community prompted by compulsions of daily existence brings about a certain synergy within itself, a certain collaboration, among the people living in Dharavi, and therefore is able to carry on. I think that has been the character of many cities in the course of history. And I feel that that will continue to be the case, even if it is not a slum. In these very big cities, it's quite possible that there will be many, many parts where the city government or the provincial government will not be able to respond to the needs. And therefore, one has to try and see how those community needs or those needs at the community level can be met. Apart from Dharavi, Bombay has had a very long history of something called advanced locality management, whereby different municipal wards, the residents and so on, they used to come together and said, all right, these are the things which we will do. And in many cities, you do have those kinds of examples. I'm not regarding them as part of a urban management design. They reflect the diversity, they reflect, the different ways by which communities evolve and communities find some kind of an identity by themselves. So I do not, I look upon that as a part of a city phenomenon. But I don't think conscious efforts need to be made to formalize them. Because if you try to say other slums should also be like Dharavi, it may not work. In the case of Dharavi, it has worked. One of the ways it has worked is that there have been at least some 20-25 different plans for getting rid of Dharavi and sort of building something in it. The strength of the community lies in the fact they have been able to successfully resist all these grand plans. The other side, the uniqueness, which you say that as far as the leadership is concerned, you know, the small municipality and so on. If you take the Greater London example, after a good deal of debate, when that Greater London Council was formed, and then Margaret Thatcher said, this is big government, and I don't want it, and I want it abolished. And then she had a minister for London, and the national government took on the responsibility for administering London. That did not help. And then, you know, after a gap of about some 7-8 years, the Greater London Authority was reintroduced. But there was a fairly extensive exercise on what should be the responsibilities of the boroughs and what should be the responsibilities of the Greater London Authority, and how the Greater London Authority will have an assembly of its own, and how the Greater London Authority will have a directly elected mayor, and how these 35 boroughs, if I remember, will have, you know, their own setup. It was a fairly time-consuming political exercise to decide on what are metropolitan level functions and what are local level functions, and what should be the functional domain of the directly elected mayor of GLC. Now, he's supposed to be responsible for strategic planning of all of Greater London. He's responsible for transport. He's responsible for a few other, you know, functions as well. And how are conflicts between boroughs and the Greater London Authority to be reconciled? Incidentally, the Greater London Assembly constituencies are different from the borough constituencies. It's not like our Indian Constitution provision, where a local level councillor is metamorphosed as a metropolitan councillor. They are two different electoral arrangements. And in the most recent elections which took place a few months ago between Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone, it was a closely contested election. It was rather interesting that though Boris Johnson was supposed to belong to the same party as David Cameron, in his acceptance speech he said, we survived the rains, we survived the BBC, and we also survived the endorsement by David Cameron. That was the kind of distance that the directly elected mayor of London wanted to place. The people of London recognize the directly elected mayor Livingstone. They feel that he is an accountable person. I want to draw another example. One of the reasons why Delhi is comparatively doing a better job is it is a de facto city-state, a de facto city-state. Sheila Dixit likes to call herself the Chief Minister of Delhi. In effect, she is the mayor. She would not like to be called that. But she knows that in the event of trouble, politically, hers will be one of the heads to roll. And I feel there is an answer here. In many South Asian cities, the point of political accountability is absent. And as a result, in the diffused atmosphere, you do not know who is responsible for what.
Who does the Delhi police answer?
Delhi police answers to the national government.
Home Ministry.
Yes, please.
I'm Singaporean, but I'm half an Indian, I would say. I spent several years of my life there. So I speak with some level of candid here. I hope you don't mind. Sir, I see that, I think your position on greater metropolitan control is great. It might be a solution. But could there be an adverse effect? In the sense that, as you know, many situations when there's increased amount of parties involved, things fail. From the Gurgaon city, where there were less government intervention to the state where it is now, to several instances like even Gandhinagar and so on and so forth. There are too many people involved, and therefore the corruptions will set in, the dysfunctionality will set in as well. So could there be a short-term worse scenario if more metropolitan power is given to a local authorities?
So many Indian megacities have this stigma of slums. And many years ago in Chennai, there was an effort by DMK administration of that period, what was known as the slum clearance effort, which didn't seem to have had much effect. What is the extent of success in these megacities addressing the stigma of slums? Thank you.
In response to the earlier questions, you were mentioning about the role of the mayor and how often in a lot of Indian cities, the figure of the mayor has almost become like a figurehead. So in terms of these tiers of political representation, that you have the councillors, the MLAs, and the is there any solution as to how to sort of increase the visibility of the Indian mayors of Indian cities vis-a-vis, you mentioned the London example, or are we sort of condemned to a situation where there's sort of figures who can't do much?
I think the questions regarding the powers to local councils and mayors, to some extent they are related, but let me deal with the question of slums. I would not regard the slums as a stigma of a society. I mean, they have been it's a question of what you regard as a slum. In the case of Bombay, 60% of the people in Bombay Corporation, Greater Bombay Corporation area are living in slums. But they are not settlements of the poor. It's because of the unavailability of service land, and a very large percentage of the people are priced out, of the housing market, affordable housing market, that they are, taking that kind of a shelter. So in a way, there is a certain dynamics here. And from time to time, various things, have been tried out. In the case of Calcutta, for instance, the slums came in mainly because when Calcutta became an industrial city, it coincided with a certain distress-induced migration from some of the other states. Without that supply of labor, Calcutta as a colonial city could not have reached its industrial prominence. Only yesterday, I read in the Singapore Straits paper that there is a shortage of labor for the small and medium enterprises, and restrictions on migrant labor will eventually hurt SMEs. So in a way, you find in the course of history of cities across the world, people have moved and they perform an important economic function. And as long as they are prepared to accept distinctly lower levels of services because of their personal enhancement of income. They are performing a useful economic function. And these definitions of slums, what is a slum, where should they exist, and so on and so forth. There have been cases like that. So in 1970s, when we had this big exercise, late 1960s, as far as the Calcutta slum areas were concerned, it was suggested that let us treat the slums as part of the existing housing stock. And what they needed was the improvement of services. So let us provide those services. We went up with that program to the government of India. Jawaharlal Nehru himself was emotionally very much upset about slums. And he often said, it's a shame on the national conscience that we have slums and we should get rid of them. Get rid of them and do what? Where do they go? All right. Then we went into slum upgradation. We did not do this alone. They were doing it in the kampungs of Indonesia. They were doing it in the Tondo foreshore of Manila. Lachlan Curry in South America was arguing in its favor. Internationally, people were recognizing that so long as this economic process works, you will find this supply of labor in search of employment. And so long as employment is found, that migration will take place. They may be communities of migrants, they may be communities of others. And therefore we started incorporating. Now once again you find that, as our friend said, once again you find you are now looking at slums, not as settlements of productive people. You are looking at slums as people occupying prime land. And the motivation is, how do we capture that land? And in order to capture that land and accumulate further capital, how do we get rid of it? So it's a sort of political equation that is taking place. So when you invent a principle called monetization of urban land, in some circumstances it can be a benign principle, but quite often it can be a very devious, ruthless, discriminatory principle. And that is where the state comes in. Where do you hold the balance of public interest vis-a-vis private rationality? So it's a very tough question. And you're not going to be able to solve it by looking upon slums as a stigma. Okay. As far as powers to the local councillors are concerned, I would like to believe that corruption is not the exclusive domain of local politicians. The propensity to be corrupt is widely distributed across the political spectrum. A municipal councillor genetically is not more corrupt than a member of parliament. So if that be the truth, then and similarly, mind you, vesting of powers, the same argument can be used by saying, why vest powers of a minister? Because the minister may become corrupt. So if you say, don't vest powers on a councillor because he will become more corrupt, I don't think that is a fair argument. The answer lies in dealing, with other things. Now, the question with regard to the mayors is very, very important. And that is where perhaps, certainly in the case of South Asia, because we are very large, populous countries, as a result of this constitutional amendment, today we have 3 million elected representatives in India, 3 million from rural and urban local bodies. 1/3 of them have to be women. Now, we have about 6,000, which is the sum total of all the members of the provincial assemblies and all the members of the 2 houses of parliament. So the 6,000 people have been in power for quite long. And now they have to share power with 3 million elected representatives. Now, this is not going to be an easy arrangement at all, because the arithmetics of representation has changed. But the chemistry of representation has to be worked out very, very carefully. That is part of the problem. What is the domain of the local people and what's the domain of the other levels of people? From that point of view, why should we not have, whether it is an elected or whether he is an appointed head of a city, it does not matter whether he is a mayor or whether he is an appointed commissioner, but give him clear set of responsibilities and hold him accountable. Unfortunately, the term of office of a mayor in India varies from 1 year to 5 years. Now, 1 year mayor is an absurdity. I mean, Delhi's mayor is a 1 year wonder. And even though you have now created 3 mayors instead of 1, by the time they find out where their city boundary is, it is time for them to go. It's an absurd situation. And there's no point in having those kind of ceremonial mayors. I mean, if you were to ask me, you've been living in Delhi, who is the mayor of, I don't know. You ask anybody in Bombay, who is the mayor? They would not know. So, I don't think we can afford to have these kind of ceremonial entities. And from that point of view, there is definitely a case for revisiting some of that. I think in essence it is a question once again of whether you are prepared to, if you accept the democratic principles of organization, whether you are prepared to vest people with authority. Because I do believe if you don't give a person authority, you have no right to demand accountability.
Thank you. We'll take that as absolutely the last question, yeah? Because we are running out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Your command of the details of these different metropolitan areas is incredible. I obviously can't ask you any question that's specific to the Indian context, which is going to be at the kind of level that you've already been speaking at. But I'd just like to revisit one of the final issues that you left us with, and that's that disconnect between the conditions of possibility on the supply side for metropolitanization and the seeming absence of the demand for to meet that. And my question has to do with what the motivation for the supply side in your case, going back to the personal dimension of this, is in the first place, and in particular perhaps rumination on where that motivation comes from. And I'm wondering whether, does it have to do with there being at the supranational level certain discourses through the World Bank, for example, about appropriate scales of governance? Does it come from recognition of there being models or cases out there in the world that might be or might not be suitable for the Indian context? Or is it precisely because of recognition of this historical antecedent whereby there was a time when things were done better and the possibility of rekindling that? But perhaps just as an addendum to that final point, is it also possible that looking back at that earlier period as a resource for doing things better, we wouldn't be using terms like the city as an engine of growth? So that in itself is something which seems to be post-1991, a way in which we understand the function of urban regions.
So that's it.
No, I think those are very, very important questions. As far as the demand side is concerned, the supply side one can argue. I mean, let us assume for the time being that since I have spent much of my working life in wrestling with these issues, some of my colleagues and myself are possessed with this mad idea, and let us say that the supply side is on account of our personal madness. But leaving that aside, on the demand side, I feel it's very much a case of metropolitan survival. Take, for example, water. In the case of Bangalore, today water for Bangalore has to come from Kaveri, taken from a long distance and pumped for nearly, over 1,000-meter, elevation. Hyderabad says we can't draw water only from Krishna, so we have to go to Godavari now to draw water. Even in a place like Calcutta, where the river Hooghly, the salinity levels have distinctly dropped, but nevertheless, the individual municipalities are trying to suck water below their feet by deep tube wells and only taking more and more arsenic. Okay, if you take, for example, a case like, even drainage, it is now clearly demonstrated that Bombay is seriously subject to flooding and vulnerability unless the common water courses are taken care of. Now, these are metropolitan level issues. They cannot be sorted out at the individual constituent level. We were pleasantly surprised to find that there were at least 1,000 water bodies in the so-called 7,000 square kilometer area of Hyderabad. Mindlessly, road projects are undertaken, new area development is undertaken, which is plugging these water bodies. Ecology, I think, is going to be a very major issue which has to be dealt with at the metropolitan level. Same thing is true with regard to transport connectivity. So, your basic need of water, your basic need of drainage, your basic need of transport, and importantly, your basic need of solid and liquid waste removal. When all these entities come together in one particular geographical space, you need a metropolitan view of things. Planning is equally important. How much land do you need? Do you need to expand metropolitan areas so that additional lands can be captured for possible market development, possible real estate development? Why do you need this? What kind of a process do you have to go through in order to establish, your jurisdiction? My feeling is that these questions, as investment increases, as employment increases, as the demand for space increases, these questions of contestation will become very much more severe. And they have to be dealt with, World Bank or no World Bank. They have to be dealt with because these are problems which are created as, problems of growth, not problems of stagnation. And we have to address them. And they have to be addressed both at the sub-metropolitan and metropolitan level.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could perhaps go on, but fortunately we are running out of time. So I don't think this is the kind of a discussion that I can sum up basically in any particular way, except to say that we have so much of experience and wisdom here in Ramakrishnan that actually, if you look at South Asian city problems from sitting in Singapore, it does sometimes appear as though always the question arises: look at a managed city like Singapore, why can it not be managed in a similar way in South Asia? And I think what Professor Ramakrishnan has been able to do here is to point out the kind of diversity of interests of institutions